Appreciate members of the committee joining us for our second hearing of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee for FY16. Today we're going to examine the budget requests for the Indian Health Service. I want to thank Dr. Rubidoux, our Senior Advisor to the Secretary for American Indians and Alaska Natives, and then Mr. McSwain, the Acting Director of IHS, for appearing before us today. Briefly, just a reminder in terms of how we proceed here in the committee. It's early bird rule for recognizing members for questions. I'm going to call on members in the order in which they have arrived, and we'll do 6-minute rounds. I see that Mr. McSwain has arrived. We're glad that you are here safely, and as I mentioned, there's no, you don't have to get a tardy excuse to show up here. We appreciate the efforts that you made, and hopefully you have a minute here to just settle before we move to statements and questions. As I noted in my opening statement last week in this subcommittee, we haven't marked up an interior bill in 5 years. And likewise, it's been over 5 years since we've done a hearing on the IHS budget, so this hearing is long overdue. With over half of the federally recognized tribes in Alaska and all health care delivered by tribal organizations through compacting agreements, it's impossible for me to overstate the significance of the Indian Health Service to the people of my state. And I know that Senator Udall also shares my view of the importance of this agency, so I look forward to us exercising more oversight over IHS while we serve as Chairman and Ranking Member of this subcommittee. Now, turning to the budget request for the service, it is $5.1 billion for the programs within this subcommittee's jurisdiction. This is an increase of $461 million, which is 10% over last year's enacted level. There's some very worthy increases in this budget that I certainly support. I support the increase of $55 million more to fully pay contract support costs and $100 million more to address the $2 billion backlog on the current health care facilities construction list. I also support the additional $25 million request to provide for suicide prevention and combating substance abuse among our Native youth. But as I have said at all the budget hearings that I have chaired, whether in this committee or on the Energy Committee, the administration developed these budgets assuming that sequester would go away in FY16. I don't think that this is an assumption that we can make. Even if there is some agreement related to the sequester, we cannot assume the agreement will provide the amount of resources that the President has requested government-wide. Regardless of whether there is an overall agreement related to the sequester, I am committed to working with the Budget Committee to provide sequester relief for the IHS in the same fashion as the relief that is provided to the VA. I believe that all federal health care providers should be placed on equal footing, particularly when the VA and the IHS work cooperatively to provide services to both veterans and Native Americans at their respective facilities. So while I appreciate the desire to increase funding to meet our obligations to Native people, the reality is that in this difficult budget climate, we're likely to have roughly the same amount to spend as we did last year. And because that is the case, it's vital that we work closely with the service in establishing priorities within this tight environment. I do want to raise a proposal in your budget that concerns contract support costs. You are aware how critical funding of these costs is to Alaska health care providers as they have compacted to provide all health care services for Alaska Natives. In FY14, the administration proposed capping the amounts available to tribes for contract support costs. I believe that proposal was an effort to circumvent the tribe's victory in the Rama case decided by the Supreme Court. But thankfully, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and in the House and Senate determined that this was not the right approach. We rejected that proposal. In the service's current budget proposal, the administration has announced it will not only pay full contract support costs for the current fiscal year at a cost of $718 million, but also that beginning in FY17, contract support costs would become mandatory spending for 3 years. Now, frequently, this administration has made general statements about providing mandatory funding for certain programs, but after making the statements, it fails to send up a legislative proposal. When it comes to this particular issue, your budget request does not have any specific legislative language. When we get to the questions, that's something I want to explore in greater detail. As an appropriator, I'm generally not a supporter of moving programs to the mandatory side of the ledger where they don't have to compete with other priorities each year. However, the Supreme Court in the Rama case essentially made contract support costs an entitlement. And as appropriators, we have no discretion over what amounts to include in this bill because the CBO scores our bill based on whatever agency says our full support costs. So given the circumstances, I think that exploring mandatory funding and figuring out a way to responsibly pay for it is entirely appropriate. So again, I thank our witnesses for being here. I turn to Ranking Member Udall for any comments that he may make.